Sean McClain's basically awesome. So I've known him for a long time, and I like the kid a lot. Sean is on active duty with U.S. Space Force at the 608th Air Operations Center, Barksdale, Louisiana. He recently completed his second master's degree through Air University's Air Command and Staff College. His thesis, Celestial Sentinels, a framework for cislunar space domain awareness in 2035, was cleared for public release. That's what he's going to be talking about quite a bit today. A 2007 graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, he has served multiple operational tours. His last assignment was requirements manager in the Space Domain Awareness Branch at Headquarters Air Force Space Command. That predates U.S. Space Force.
Yep.
Since 2015, Sean's career has also featured extensive science and technology, experimentation, and innovation-related work. Sean transferred as one of the first, 2,000 people? Sean transferred to the U.S. Space Force in October 2020.
Yeah, the initial cadre of Air Force.
It is important to note that his expressed views are his own and do not represent the United States Air Force, United States Space Force, or any other U.S. government entity. So, Major McClain, thanks a lot for being here. Really excited to hear what you have to say.
All right. So, yeah, again, this is a presentation kind of tailored for this specific forum. And with that, I'll jump right in. So again, here's a disclaimer pulled from my thesis. And then again, for this presentation, these views are my own, don't necessarily represent views of Air Force, Space Force, DoD, etc. So I'm going to kind of set the stage and just try to provide context, because I think I heard when I was talking to people about what I was trying to do with this, they were wondering kind of how it tied into Lunar Development Conference and why would a military person speak at this sort of thing. So this is just kind of a quick, 2-minute slide that or just kind of walks you through the history of how we got here at a very, very high level, simplified, no nuance, just a quick and dirty understanding of the timeline of how we almost got U.S. Space Force back in the early 2000s with the 2001 Space Commission Report, also known as the Rumsfeld Commission Report. But that was quickly overshadowed by real world events. 9/11 happened, and then that pretty much turned off any feasible financial sense to budget for U.S. Space Command at the same time as standing up a Space Force when we had the War on Terror kicking off. So if you notice, the timeline for U.S. Space Command getting stood down and U.S. North Command getting stood up was the same date. So we stood down the old U.S. Space Command in early 2000s, stood up NORTHCOM, that's still active, and that continues with its mission to this day. Fast forward a few years into that, we had the PRC, People's Republic of China, ASAT test in 2007. That was a kind of a wake-up call. And then at the bottom, just kind of tie it all in together too. If you notice, there's this counter space continuum, or just how can people schwack our stuff in orbit, and then why would they want to do that? And I try to just, again, oversimplify what is space power projection, and why are we as the DoD or national security experts interested now with a separate service and reinterested with a U.S. Space Command? Well, it's basically because the three big crown jewels that we have up there are missile warning, SATCOM, satellite communications, and global positioning system, or GPS. Those three provide essentially the military soft power element of the DIME model you might have heard: diplomatic, information, military, and economic. Essentially how nation states communicate through various means with each other, how they leverage those national tools of instruments of power to achieve their own ends, their own strategic ends. And then money. Let's not beat around the bush. GPS is a very profitable venture that we still operate on the DoD side, but it is free for all. It's a service that we intend to continue to provide free for all. Because it's an element of soft power, it also makes a lot of money for a lot of people. And that's just a really big reason for us to keep it going. And that's just an indicator and a great example of how Space Force as a service is essentially providing a financial boost to the economy, and kind of how it justifies its existence in that respect. But all that to say that there is a lot of financial reason. There is a lot of soft power reason for us to continue to use the space domain from a national military security standpoint. And that's why we have a combatant command for space. And that's why we now have a separate space force. So all that to kind of set the stage for my thesis and just kind of going forward, imagining what the future of the Space Force would kind of have its responsibilities for in the future. So this whole notion of cislunar space domain awareness, when I was writing my thesis, I didn't really have a good reference for understanding it myself. So I basically morphed my thesis into becoming that, benchmark reference thesis for what do you want to know and how much time do you have. So that's what this was. And the best analogy that I can come up with for explaining this to somebody in an elevator speech is it's a lot like the Arctic and Antarctic regions today. The South China Sea, East China Sea to a lesser extent, really it's the Arctic zones. They both share these difficulties of access, communication, and just general situational awareness. Just due to the environment itself, the orbital mechanics make less sense for traditional orbits to go up there. So you have to have dedicated missions for polar orbits to do polar communications, for example, anything like that. It has to have its own dedicated funding set aside just to support Arctic operations. So that alone kind of makes it compete with all the other stuff going on at the lower latitudes. But with the Arctic ice melting, it now presents new economic opportunities. And you're seeing this geopolitical tension, geopolitical issues play out. And it's just going to be really interesting, I think, over the next few years as we see how the Arctic and the Antarctic situations play out. I think those are going to be interesting litmus tests from a national security perspective for how we can expect to see the cislunar operational area evolve. So that's just jumping into the first of my slides here with the thesis. So that kind of set you the terrestrial example or a good analogy. So now I'm going to try to walk you through this set of charts here. These are 5 charts. I'm going to build you a layer of physical, economic, and then I'm going to just throw you the actual cislunar space domain awareness architecture that I proposed at the end of my thesis. And then I'm just going to give you everything at the end. On the left, you're going to have the legend that's going to kind of help you see a lot of information at once, but it's to kind of help you understand where everything could go, the art of the possible, and to not completely overwhelm you. I spent a lot of time trying to make these slides intuitive. There's a lot in here. You can just kind of pour over them, but the idea is they present a lot of information at once so that you can go over it and just kind of think through things and get a better sense of what is actually going on out there. You've had a lot of speakers talk about the Lagrange points already, what's going on the moon. I'm really just going to focus on the real relationship between the Earth and the moon and how you can take advantage of some of the orbital orbitology, the orbital mechanics available, Lagrange points included, but how would you take advantage of some of these orbits in a way that gives you the ability to place platforms there to support an overarching cislunar economy, essentially. That's really what this was about, is if you have the plan to have a cislunar economy in the near future, where can you put stuff to maximize awareness of what is going on within that area? That was the whole point of this. So this is the physical layer, and Geo is a nice reference point with those icons of what we basically have today. And then I'm going to advance forward to kind of give you an idea of what is the art of the possible within the cislunar operational area with the arbitrary, not so arbitrary time epic date of 2035. It's not too distant in the future. It kind of gives the reader and the community enough time to really consider that some of these things are possible. And you've seen some of the previous presentations, some of the hardware, it's coming together, the concepts, the policy, the strategy, all of that's coming together. So I think the whole notion of what I believe I heard also earlier, the Starship singularity, where it's just going to change everything. If you take that base assumption of the Starship singularity and just the whole idea of space access costs lowering dramatically, this does become a real consideration, I think, for military planners and just the general Space Force community. It does kind of present this own challenge of, if you have this much expected service volume traffic, if you will, space traffic management issues just on the civilian side, you can also reasonably expect that there's going to be more of a military oversight or just military involvement, specifically, in my opinion, with regard to search and rescue. I think that's going to be one of the first missions that Space Force is going to be asked to look into and really delve deep as far as how can we support rescue in the cislunar environment, both in orbit as well as maybe on the moon. So I tend to look at it from that perspective. Why do we need to know about what's going on in the event that we need to rescue stranded people? So that's really where, again, a lot of this focus from. But there's also just all these other things going on here too. You know, you got your industries, you got stuff moving around, and you just really need to have a method or a framework to understand your opportunities for placing sensors of various phenomenologies at different locations, overlapping, complementing each other to provide an overarching architecture to know what's going on. In the same extent that we have air traffic management, one of the main goals of having a cislunar space domain awareness architecture is to support space traffic management, which would support something like cislunar search and rescue operations, as an example. And here's the cislunar search and rescue scenario that I just drafted again. I didn't delve too deep into this. It was mostly just kind of a, you know, maybe a board game analogy would be the best way to play it. Just, you know, put your tokens on the board and try to walk through what would you need if you had a stranded starship out there, the USS Olympia, and, you know, if you had previous planning efforts and you properly funded everything and you had everything where you wanted it, what would you want and where would you have it? I think we're going to need a cislunar position, navigation, and timing constellation within what I call CLOC 1. That's going to be essentially the new geobelt, if you will, of the cislunar regime. It's going to be where we place a lot of the same things that we put in GEO now to support terrestrial Earth services. CLOC 1 is essentially going to be, Celestial Line of Communication 1, CLOC 1, is going to be where we put a lot of those same services and platforms to enable the same type of service expectations that we now enjoy on the Earth. So that's essentially what I put there on that large green dotted line around the Earth and the Moon to show that that's essentially a possible orbit. Yes, it does get more complicated with the three-body problem, but if you have fuel to burn, then you can modify it continuously to maintain the intent of that orbit to achieve the same service expectations. Again, I didn't delve too deep in the technical. Again, it's just, this is what essentially you can do, assuming you have some other things like the ability to refuel, like the ability to place a lot of volume up there using something like Starship for high volume material replacement. So this assumes that there's servicing involved. There's a lot of assumptions baked into these slides just to kind of give you the idea that if we get all these technologies up and running, some of these things do become actually pretty feasible, but they're all necessary to support each other. And then this is the final cislunar SDA architecture that I came up with just to kind of give an idea of where everything would go, and just to kind of tie it all together that, you know, you're going to need sensors of various phenomenologies, opportunities for placement, the command and control nodes, and yeah, essentially what is the art of the possible. And this is the final cislunar operational area, OV1, which is kind of a military term. Just basically, this is everything, and just kind of throws it all in one chart and tries to show you how everything is related to each other. So that's it. I'm going to come back to this slide in a second, but I also just wanted to add these last two slides. This one I think is relevant too for the audience who may not be aware of some of the other stuff that's been going on in DoD, military publication, and just general awareness. We have what we used to call the range of military operations in the upper left, the ROMO. That's presented in joint publication 1, basically joint publication 1. So it's meant to be your guide as a military member to what's going on, how to think in a joint all service perspective. And we kind of use this to kind of teach ourselves how to interpret and relate ourselves to warfare or just competition or conflict. But that's been updated essentially with Joint Doctrine Note 1-19 Competition Continuum, which came out in June of 2019. And in my opinion, it's just really taking the old spectrum of conflict of range of military operations, the conflict continuum, and it just expands with the DIME model into a more diplomatic, information, and economic continuum, and it overlays all that with the traditional military instrument of national power. So now military planners and strategists and just everyone across the board really needs to better understand how they fit in, not just within a military sense, but within an overarching great power competition sense. And the reason that I think is relevant to this audience is everything that you just heard up to this point let's also keep in mind that we have other national players who are also interested in their own plans for going to the moon and developing things, which I think makes this slide just something you want to kind of have in your back pocket. Just remember that we're going to be competing up there in the future as much as we're competing down here in everything. So it's just helpful to understand that what we choose to do and how we choose to do it. I think I heard earlier, the narrative is important. We really want to better understand how can we compete across a wide array of issues, fronts, initiatives, programs, and stories, so that we are in a position as the United States and our allies to where we can still have essentially free and open commerce, trade, et cetera, all those things that we like with our values. And then I'll close again with another kind of recent publication of the last 2 years. There's links provided in the notes page, and I think I added this to my upload speaker portal. This should be available on the website now or later. Again, I'll just highlight a couple. I think one that people will really kind of be able to sink their teeth into is the, on the bottom, I think McClain already talked about this day one, the new era for deep space exploration development. That was White House policy. That kind of really changed radically some of the previous space policies. I think in a good way, it kind of really opens the aperture for private venture capitalists to just go forth and do what they do, and just kind of have a good working relationship from the DoD perspective to encourage more economic and commercial ventures out there. The next one that I really think people will enjoy reading or just looking at, because I think it's just a great product, is the Aerospace Corporation's Future Map. So I'll give a shout out to Ms. Kara Kunzeman, who is the lead agent over there for getting this futures map set up. She's a chief futurist, I think. I don't want to butcher her title, but her job is to think about the future. And so she had a really great team really map out in a really, again, visual friendly way, everything that's going on in the future and how those things will intersect with each other. So that map, there's a lot going on, but it's just a really good thing that you can just kind of open up and spend your time looking at and just kind of wondering, how is it that what I'm doing is kind of potentially going to interact with all these other things that are also potentially going to be coming down the pipe. So yeah, and that's pretty much all I want to touch on. I'm going to go back to this slide for questions. I went through a lot really quick because I'm cognizant of the time, and I do think I expect to have questions. So I'm going to stop here. How did I do? Hopefully not too fast.
Terrific, terrific. It was drinking from a fire hose, but you knew that was going to happen. I want to spend some time on this slide, but jump into the historic document slide. I think it's like 4 slides ahead. Yeah, that one. So you've got to post links to some of these things in the chat, please, because there's a lot of people that are curious about them. I don't know the September 20 document from I know who you're talking about, who built that. That's the chief futurist for Aerospace Corp, right? She's a woman.
Yep, Kara Kunzeman.
Yeah. So I've never seen that doc, so I want to see that one. So yeah, you're just gonna have to just flood the channel with some PDF links if you don't mind.
Okay.
Do that.
I thought that this whole thing would be available on the Lunar Development Conference website later. Is that true? Yeah. If they can download this slideshow, all the links for these things are buried in the notes page of this slide.
Ah, terrific. Thanks a lot. Perfect. Yep. Okay. We spoke yesterday to General Warden, and he talked about the Warden line. Do you want to talk about that? Garrettson's going to talk a bit about it later this afternoon.
Yeah, Garrettson, I think, is more knowledgeable on the Warden line. Okay. I don't know less or more than General Warden himself. But yeah, I mean, I am familiar with it, and I think if you had any questions about it, I'd refer to either of those two.
Okay, so there is a whole lot going on this slide, right? These are all, you know, some of these are military assets, most of these are civil, commercial, academic assets. I think what you're telling us here is the cislunar environment is going to get really, really busy. Yeah. Yes.
With again, no numbers assigned to any of these,
yep.
Just the idea of what is potentially out there. Yes, things could get busy really quick, and depending on what industries take off first, that's just going to be where, again, all the interested government stakeholders are just going to need to keep an eye on that, so that at least from a DoD perspective, we can continue to do our part in the space domain of making sure that those civilian and commercial agents and stakeholders can expect to do whatever it is that they would like to do, free from unfriendly action, shall we say.
I want to point out some of the comments in the chat because they're epic. First of all, Michael Mealing's like, that's a very expensive board game. And Professor Thangbelu is like, that, let's make a board game out of that. That looks really fun. The tokens are really cool. I know that Sean worked really hard on this. Like, he took something that's monumentally complex and turned it into something that people can understand, even to the point where the red dots around the Lagrange points, the wide thin ovals are to showcase that those are unstable Lagrange points, and the full circles around EML 4 and 5 are actually stabilized. So yeah, there's just so much going on here. And you know, I'm not going to let you off screen without talking about the green line. So what else do I call the green line?
You call the green line the McClain line.
I do.
I'll call it that. I
know that you will
operational area boundary.
You will never call it. You will never call it the McClain line, but it deserves a name. It deserves a title. You came up with it, so I call it the McClain line. In the same way that we have the Carmen line as one differentiator and the Warden line as another differentiator. We've got to have a title for this piece of cosmic real estate. So, so what does this line represent? What does it mean?
I think Peter Gerritson's going to get into it later. I've started reading more of his cislunar primer, but I think the definition, if I had to go back in my thesis, would be, according to Peter Gerritson's primer, this green boundary should be the outer boundary of the sun, earth, moon regime of influence. So as soon as you go past that green line, essentially the gravitational influence of the moon becomes negligible relative to the earth sun, or excuse me, sun earth gravitational system.
Right. So this is
cislunar regime.
This is the cislunar environment that encompasses all of the Lagrange points, including EML2, which is often kind of ignored, but certainly pretty darn important. Okay, we are running quick out of time. Michael Mealing would like to ask a question about, in 2020, there was much discussion about blue water versus brown water debate with respect to national security. Can you tell me who you think won that battle? And I can describe it a little bit more if you like.
Again, I really don't look at it as a battle. I think there's pretty good agreement on it. I think really the way that I look at that, and I think most people after they listen to it or participate in it look at it, is it's just a question of timing and shifting the money around. So it's actually at the end of my slides here too. You can kind of take my 2 cents on it, but I think there's going to be an eventual transition, but there's also going to be a bunch of realistic real world events between now and then. Nobody has a crystal ball. So there's going to be all these things that play out that are just going to beg the question, how does the needs of the cislunar environment with everything going on at the time compare with the needs of anything going on anywhere else, essentially on the terrestrial ground? So eventually, you know, I think other people explain it. Right now, the money is down here. We are getting money from up there, but the locus, the general gravitational pull of all of our financial geopolitical considerations are still tied to Earth. So once you start moving a lot of the industry off planet, a lot of the other things off planet, people living off planet, voters, taxpayers living off planet, that's where you start really seeing a lot of the funding shift towards the cislunar environment. And that's where I think you're going to start seeing more of a, quote, blue water influence become much more apparent. I just don't know, or don't need to, nobody knows when that's going to happen because there's going to be so many different things. It's just going to be a gradual transition.
Exactly. We're going to transition off. Thanks a lot, Major McClain.